afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today with Wes Olson. We're very excited to have him join us today to share more of his knowledge. I'd like to take a moment to say that the team with Alberta Agrisystems Living Lab and the SAGE project are grateful to live, work, and be in relation with many people across different traditional territories in Western Canada, covering all regions of Western Canada. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to improving our relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and their knowledge. And with that, I'd like to welcome Teresa Porter and introduce her to our folks today. Take it away, Teresa.
Hey everyone, I'm Teresa. I have the pleasure of introducing Wes today, but I'll just introduce myself first. So I'm joining the call from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm first generation, born on Turtle Island in my family. I was born and raised on the unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations territory in the West Coast. And I'm the project manager and soil health curriculum developer for the Ekanatak Aski SAGE project. We work with First Nations across the prairies, sharing knowledge of soil and agroecosystem health from both Indigenous and Western science perspectives. So we're happy to be co-presenting this webinar with the Alberta Agrisystems Living Lab and the Bridge to Land Water Sky Living Lab. So Wes has worked with Bison for 40 plus years. I think I remember Wes mentioning last year that it was his 40th year working with Bison. So Wes was, correct me if I'm wrong, Wes, but Wes has worked as a national park warden in Banff National Park, in Waterton, Elk Island National Park, and also worked in Grasslands National Park. He's been very involved in bringing buffalo back to their lands across Turtle Island and even in Siberia. And spending that much time with buffalo and being able to observe them, Wes learned a lot about them and their ecological role. And from my experience, Wes has been very generous in sharing this knowledge. This is the second time that Wes is doing a webinar with us, and both he and his partner, Joanne Janelle, who's a co-creator of their beautiful book, The Ecological Buffalo, which I guess you can't see based on my Zoom settings, but check it out. They've been really very supportive, very generous, and really open collaborators on our SAGE project activities, our Buffalo Learning Circles. So I've personally learned so much from both of you, and I really appreciate you joining us again today. So thank you so much, Wes, and just a heartfelt thank you from the SAGE team.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and good to see everybody. I guess we have fairly limited time, so I'm going to dive right into it. The talk is called Bison, Bugs, and Birds, Assisting the Recovery of Endangered Species. I've given this presentation a couple times, but like I mentioned to the ladies before we got on air, I've tweaked it, so this is the first time you'll see some of the images that are in this presentation. And I have to give credit to my lovely wife, Joanne Janelle, for her photographs. Without those, I'd just be a handsome talking head in front of you. So credit to her for the photographs. The ancient relationships between bison, bugs, and birds go back, well, literally millions of years. Probably at least 3 million years birds had coexisted with bison. So how and when did dung-loving insects arrive in North America? These are the things that we'll discuss shortly. How and when did passerine birds get to this continent? Where and when did bison first appear in North America? And is there any evidence that the prehistoric birds benefited from bison on the landscape? Do bugs and birds benefit from having bison on the landscape is sort of the pertinent question here. These are, I refer to them as the hitchhikers. There's over 300,000 species of beetles alone in Canada, 730 different bird species, the majority of which are probably insectivores at some point. And I called them hitchhikers because how did they get here? Well, they got here because Gondwana, this massive supercontinent that existed for 600 million years ago, its breakup into today's continents began around 180 million years ago, and the ancestors of all living dung beetles and many other species originated from Gondwana, Australia, about 70 million years ago. As Gondwana split up via plate tectonics, insects hitched a ride on these new continents as they floated around the globe. When did dung-loving insects arrive in North America? About 70 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous. They think is when the majority of dung beetle species populated North America. And of course, dung beetles evolved first on dinosaur dung and later on mammalian dung. I'm not sure I'd want to meet this fellow in the bush. Yep. Like the bottom of my screen is covered up with the text. Oh yeah, dung beetles have lived with mammals for up to 53 million years. So long, long relationship with these species. Ancestors of all living passerine birds, perching birds, also originated from Australia about 47 million years ago. And once plate tectonics got stopped messing with the continents, a vast cold, dry grassland formed that extended from Western Europe across Asia and into northwestern North America. This ecosystem was known as the Mammoth Steppe, and its eastern terminus was roughly the Mackenzie River Valley in Northwest Territories. This is the Mammoth Steppe as it once existed. It traveled all the way from the UK across Europe and Asia, through Beringia and into North America and down into the Central Great Plains. And all this Beringia formed when all the glaciers had sucked up so much water that the ocean levels were 425, roughly, feet lower than they are today. And that lower water level created Beringia. Beringia was a vast landscape that connected Asia with North America. This is a pretty decent illustration of it. And Jeff Bond created the first map that shows the topography of Beringia and the watersheds that fell within it. Beringia was huge. It was the equivalent to BC and Alberta combined. And Beringia lasted for about 800,000 years. It's a very long time in modern standards. It allowed the movement of terrestrial mammals across the Mammoth Steppe through Asia and into North America. These photographs are all northern Yukon, where the sort of the peak of Beringian megafauna lived in North America. Many of North America's 383 terrestrial mammal species evolved here, and most of them made their way eventually south of the ice sheets and into continental North America. Then came the Quaternary extinction event. And this is something that's puzzled me for a long time. Everything changed. Some people think it was a sudden event, but it actually took about 2,000 years. But it caused the extinction of not just dozens of species, but also the complex web of life that existed for all of those 800,000 years that animals were in North America. This is a saber-toothed cat and a bison that it had killed. And just a side note about saber-toothed cats, the spacing between their canines was perfectly spaced to match the space between the intercostal muscles of a bison rib cage. So they didn't have to wrestle with the animal. They'd simply stab it, walk away and wait for the pneumothorax to kill the bison and feast on it. The Quaternary extinction event was between 13,800 years ago to 11,400. That date, 11,400, is roughly the start of the Holocene, the epoch that we're currently in. Of the 38 megafauna genera, not species, but genera that lived prior to the event, the only mammal that weighed more than 400 kilograms to survive the extinction event was bison. It's really quite remarkable. Every other species died during the Quaternary extinction event. 135,000 years ago, the first bison species made its way across Beringia and into North America. And for the next 123,000 years, bison priscus was the dominant bison across the northern part of North America. He was followed by bison latifrons. This is the biggest bison that's ever lived. There was one in Europe that was actually taller, bison mineri, but it weighed less than latifrons. Horn tip to horn tip, over 2 meters on these big guys. He was followed by Bison antiquus, more of a central Great Plains animal, and then by Bison occidentalis. Bison occidentalis and Bison antiquus were similar to today's modern plains and wood bison, two subspecies that were sympatric on the landscape. And they eventually bred back together again and created bison, which in turn led us to the current plains and wood bison. And as these species moved across from Asia into Beringia, they brought insects with them. And this photograph looks blurry and out of focus, but it's because all of those tiny dots are mosquitoes. There can be up to 600,000 mosquitoes per hectare. And that's just one, and there's 32 different species that live there. In addition, there's 133 species of black flies across what was Beringia. So a pretty rich environment if you're an insectivore. And of course, with that much prey, there's a lot of avian species that like to eat them. This is the yellow-rumped warbler, showing the breeding, migration, and winter ranges. And of course, breeding is up here all across the boreal forest and low Arctic Canada and Alaska. Beringia was home, or the northern parts of Canada now, that was home to 200 different bird species. Many of them are neotropical migrants. There's over, screen is covered again, 6,000 perching birds in the world. That's a lot of birds. And about, my screen is buggered up again. A lot of, a high percentage of these are passerine birds like these fellows. Combined, these ancient bison species spread out across North America. The green shows the total extent of all of the bison species that have ever lived in North America. Over the next 135 years, they occupied virtually every niche on the continent. And with them, they brought dung-loving invertebrates like this dung beetle. Not this one in particular. This is a species called Photius femitarius. And I'm not sure yet how they figured this out, but he arrived on a boat from Britain in Boston Harbor, got off there and began to populate North America. These dung beetles, of course, evolved from one bison species to another until about 3,000 years ago, when only plains and wood bison remained in North America. All the other ones had gone extinct. The historic range of plains bison covered all of the lower part of the continental United States and up into roughly where the North Saskatchewan is today. The core of the plains bison range, of course, was the mid-continental grasslands, places like the shortgrass prairie here in Grasslands National Park, the mixed grass prairie and the tall grass prairie that extended right up into the southern part of Manitoba. Huge grassland ecosystem. The historic range of wood bison, of course, was much further north. It extended down to the North Saskatchewan River, but the bulk of the populations were extended up into Alaska, Yukon, and the northwest corners of BC and that corner of Northwest Territories in Alberta. They interbred in this band of about 100-kilometer wide strip along the North Saskatchewan River, maybe 50 kilometers north and south of it, and created what some people referred to as a mountain bison. It was really not a subspecies, but an ecotype where the plains and wood bison had hybridized. And these guys made their way down the Rocky Mountain chain all the way down in towards Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. And numerous accounts of explorers working their way west through the Great Plains, bumping into all these plains bison, got to the mountains and remarked about how different the animals were that they were seeing. So I suspect there was an ecotype that once lived in that landscape. Of course, many avian species co-evolved with bison, and they did it because of these long flyways that traveled right up through the center of the Great Plains, where the bison population was most dense. Most grassland birds are, of course, migratory insectivores. The northern migration of these birds is timed to match the emergence of insects in the spring. And that's changing. As climate warms, the insects are emerging earlier, and the birds have to adapt to that earlier emergence as time goes on. The southward migration follows the insects as they enter diapause. So the birds that are nesting up here, breeding and producing young, have to follow that essentially when the insects go into hibernation as they work their way south into South America in some cases. Like this bird, the semi-palmated plover, migrates 3,200 miles per kilometer from northern South America to the Arctic. That's 6,400 kilometers return every year. Tremendous energy drain on a small bird like that to fly that distance. And you're not alone. About 50 species fly more than 10,000 kilometers from wintering to breeding grounds. At least 150 of these are neotropical migrants that make this journey every year. And historically, many of these songbirds refueled on insects on the Great Plains. This migration path for the birds is centered right down the middle of the Great Plains where the bison populations were highest. And on their way north and on their way south, it's time to fit the bison breeding season. So the highest density of insects are on the landscape at that time. So the importance of bison for insectivorous birds is high. Many grassland species were dependent on bison dung and the insects that bison dung produced. On average, a bison paddy can support up to 300 different insect species just on that one dung pad that this animal is dropping on the landscape. And of those, up to 1,000 individual insects can live on that one dung pad. So a tremendous biological output just from having bison droppings on the landscape. One of my favorite photographs there. On average, a bison can drop about 10 to 12 paddies per day. This one's been colonized by dung beetles. These are all entrance burrows. Imagine a dung beetle flying through an oxygen-rich environment, and that's splat head first into a buffalo paddy that's an anaerobic environment. The first thing they have to do is, after they land in it, is punch back up to the surface and start making air channels through that dung path so that they can forage on the microbes that are within it. Each of these dung paths can support up to 10,000 insects over the summer, up for the 10 to 12 paddies that are deposited. There's one estimate that a bison cow can, just from her own dung, produce up to a quarter of her body mass in insects every summer. And with 30 million bison on the landscape, the insect biomass was phenomenal. I'd made an attempt to try to figure out what that might have been. So I took a graph that William Hornaday had produced back in 1886 or somewhere in that range. And this is the graph. It actually represents his graph of population decline of plains bison over time, from 1861, when there were 30 million bison on the landscape, through to the late 1880s when there were none. And then based on a quarter of the body mass of an adult cow, this number is actually the number of insects produced every day in millions, in billions. Tremendous number of insects. And as you can imagine, over time, as that insect biomass began to decline, so too did the impacts on grassland birds or other insectivores that tried to live on that bison dung. So the bison dung provided, or bison themselves provided more to the landscape than just food for insectivores. And we've got one photograph I tried to find for the talk and couldn't, of a ferruginous hawk nest built almost entirely out of bones. In this case, they were cattle bones, rib cages and whatnot, stacked up into a heap. But these guys, Williams and Matson said the same thing back in 1947, that they made their nests entirely out of bleached bison bones. Everywhere Joanna and I go, we try to find nests that bison have hair in them. Mallard nest, for example. This is the great horned lark nest, bison had walked that wet clay and driven a footprint into it. Then she came along and lined the nest with bison hair, laid 2 of her eggs in the nest, and then the nest was parasitized by a brown-headed cowbird. So a completely functioning ecosystem just in that one footprint. There's some work done out of Oklahoma where they showed that just having bison hair in the nest resulted in a 30% increase in egg and chick survival, because the smell of the fiber of the hair is strong enough that it'll hide the smell of the chicks to a passing predator like a badger or a raccoon. It's also incredibly warm. It's the second warmest natural fiber in all of North America, next only to the kiviot of the muskoxen, and it's water repellent. So you get those really nasty wet spring storms. The chicks that are, or the eggs that are in here, have a much greater chance of surviving. Here's a great loggerhead shrike and its nest, aligned with the underfur of bison. Bison have 2 hair coats, an underfur that's really dense, and then a longer, darker guard hairs that are there to shed moisture off the back of the animal. The guard hairs come off in pelts or mats. There's research done in the early 1960s where they looked at the hair density on cattle, heifer bison, like yearling bison, and yearling yak. And cattle had 8,000 hairs per square inch. And on a yearling female plains bison, it was 18,000 hairs per square inch. And yak were intermediate. So tremendous density of fibers on these animals. And of course, not just birds benefit from having bison on the landscape. This Richardson ground squirrel, and you can see she's nursing pups, found this bison wallow in an area of Grasslands National Park that had not been used by bison very much at the time. And she made repeated trips back and forth from the hair that he had shed to her natal den, bringing that fiber into the nesting chamber. Yeah, it's been 140 years since bison were on that landscape, 150. She certainly hasn't been around to experience them. So how does she know the benefit of that fiber to the survival of her pups? I helped participate in the reintroduction of bison into Banff back in February of 2017, and tended them for the first couple of months that they were there. And in the spring, as the Columbian ground squirrels woke up, they'd gone to bed on a landscape that was familiar to them, and they woke up surrounded by bison. And you could see the looks of confusion on their little faces, but within a matter of 10 days, they were picking up shed hair and putting it into their nesting chambers as well. And then along came the 1860s and the Great Bison Genocide, as I call it, when the population went from roughly 30 million down to, in some places, none. Railroads and market slaughters contributed to this by splitting the North American Great Plain herds into three. And it was Kansas Pacific first that created the northern herds, one that came up into Canada, and then the Southern Pacific that split the Central Great Plains and the Southern herd later on. Those three herds each became more vulnerable then to harvesting by hide hunters. And by the 1880s, there wasn't a single live bison, plains bison in Canada. They were completely gone. And there were only 23 wild bison remaining in headwaters of the Pelican River Valley in Yellowstone National Park. At the same time, there was roughly 250 wood bison remaining in Canada. But as you can imagine, at that time, in that environment, trying to count them was difficult. So that's a very rough estimate. And those 30 million bison were gone in just 20 years. Remarkable transformation to the North American landscape. What was left was, here's Frederick Vernier's painting of the last buffalo, and this is what that landscape looked like, devoid of living life except for scavengers, and just a very sad landscape. In Canada by the 1880s, the only evidence of bison on the landscape were their bones, and by the 1890s, even then, most of the bones were gone, picked up for fertilizer and production of gunpowder, initially for the Boer War in South Africa, but then in the First World War as well. A lot of the ammunition that was used was ground up buffalo bones. And there was a huge market for the fine bones inside the nose. And they're very, very fine bones, and they were scraped out of there and turned into fine china. The queen drank her tea out of bison nostril bones. And of course, then in the spring, without those bison on the landscape, the only thing that was left was their dung. Here in Grasslands National Park, the prairie dogs come out of their den. It's a very dry landscape at that time of year. And frequently we'd watch these prairie dogs sitting on top of a bison paddy, chewing around the outside edges, benefiting from the undigested food that paddy contained. After the bison were gone, North America was empty of bovid species. Bison and cattle are the only ones that deposit a paddy versus a pellet. So it was a desperate time for any insectivore living there. But cattle fairly quickly began to replace bison on the landscape, and they moved in from the east coast and from Mexico, eventually colonizing pretty much the entire interior part of North America again. You can see how these cattle herds eventually occupied most of the landscape, in particular with Texas Longhorn drives, bringing millions of Texas Longhorns up through the Central Great Plains, contributed to the recovery of those grassland species. And by the early 1900s, almost all of North America was now occupied by cattle, and Yellowstone, of course, is surrounded by cattle. The only place that wasn't is the Canadian Shield heavy boreal forests where livestock grazing was not effective. So cattle now provided most of the dung that was so crucial for the survival of insects, birds, reptiles, and all the small mammals that depended on them. But in 1886-87, there was a massive blizzard right across the northern Great Plains into southern Canada, extended all the way down into Texas. And many of the big ranches of that free-range era were wiped out. Millions and millions of cattle died in that blizzard. And the same thing took place after those herds had recovered in the winter of 1905-06, and again killing thousands of cattle in the landscape. This photograph was just from 2013, a big blizzard that wiped out thousands of cattle across the northern Great Plains, and especially in Montana and North Dakota. This blizzard brought an end to the era of free-range cattle grazing, the period when those big ranches just let their cattle graze across the open plains. That stopped after this blizzard. Couldn't afford to do that anymore. And as a result, millions of insectivorous birds and small mammals were again impacted by the lack of cow patties on the landscape. These winters caused a switch from extensive grazing regimes like this one to where cattle then were brought home for the winter months, fed in stockyards like this, and kept there until from roughly October to May, a trend that continues even to today. There's very few places where cattle free-range through the winter months across the northern Great Plains. The result of that switch was a landscape that was devoid of bovids, devoid of dung paths, and it was empty. Right across the Great Plains, there were no bovids during the winter months. And as a result, when the insects arrived in the spring, when the birds arrived to prey on those insects in the spring, they simply weren't there. So without cattle on the range, there was reduced prey for all of these migratory birds. And that had a huge impact on their survival. You know, after 135,000 years of having bison and then cattle on the landscape providing food for these birds, they too began to suffer. And everywhere you look, 1970 appears to be the time when the decline of grassland birds began. So I wondered why, and what took place in 1970 that caused such a drastic crash in grassland birds. Everywhere you looked, 1970, they're all over the place. That transition period when all these species began to crash. It's continuing today even. Here's a graph of causes of decline of birds. 24 million or 2,400 million birds die every year from feral and domestic cats. That's disgusting. Not shown here, though, is the cause of mortality and the drugs that are used to treat livestock parasites. And that's really the crux of this presentation is the mixed blessing. Back in 1974, this fellow was looking for a bacteria. And he found one on a golf course in Japan called Streptomyces. He sent that berry to this fellow at the Merck Institute for Therapeutic Research. And together they isolated a class of drugs known as ivermectins. It's a broad group of different types of mectins, bacterial cultures. And they tweaked one and developed a drug called ivermectin, which we all have heard about, especially through COVID. Ivermectin was such an effective drug in the treatment of people with internal parasites and other debilitating diseases, and it was very rapidly introduced right across the world. And Merck today continues to donate up to 270 million doses of ivermectin to treat human parasite problems. Well, it wasn't very long before the livestock ranching industry thought, well, if it's doing such a wonderful job for people, maybe it can do the same thing for my cow. And farmers and ranchers have been searching for centuries for some way to treat the parasites. And there's huge economic losses for infestations like this. So in the early 1970s, ivermectin was introduced to the livestock industry, and it very rapidly became the prevalent drug of choice. 15% of the world's 1.3 billion cattle were treated in 1991 alone. In 2015, there's an estimated 110 million cattle just in North America. That's 3 to 4 times the number of bison that once lived on this landscape. So by the mid-1980s, though, after these populations had been treated for about a decade, concern began to be expressed in the literature about the negative impacts of ivermectins as a class, and ivermectin in particular, on insects that live on these landscapes. Cattle excrete the drug after they've been treated with it in their droppings, where it continues to kill dung-loving insects after 4 months after deposition. So imagine all these cows roaming that Great Plains landscape, dropping dung paths, and every bird trying to make a meal off of it, and not able to do that because the insects are dead. This was a study done in the States where they had a fence line on one side, a large pasture system with no drugs for dewormers, and on the other side of the fence with dewormers. And you can see the massive difference. And this is just the percentage of dung beetles. That doesn't include all the other species that were on that landscape. I did a study, and we reintroduced wood bison onto reclaimed lands on the oil sands managed by Syncrude. They wanted to know, were the bison having any impact on local fauna? So we set up a bunch of pit traps and trapped all the insects on reclaimed lands where the bison had been grazing year-round, on reclaimed lands where the bison hadn't yet been, and on native boreal forest adjacent or just outside these reclaimed areas. And you can see the difference. And this is just total beetle captures. Almost 11,000 where there were bison and only 680 where there were none. So tremendous impacts, having lots of beetles on the landscape. They treat these bison with anti-parasitic drugs, but they do it at a time of year when, once the birds come back, the drugs are flushed out of their system. So it's a healthy landscape again. There's 1,154 bird species in North America, about 45 of which are grassland birds. 12 of these are obligate grassland birds, and every one of them is facing the threat of extinction. And it's because as these birds migrate back from their wintering areas to the north, they have to have stopover places where they can find food, places where they can refuel from the energy they're expending. And historically, they could get that all along the central Great Plains where the bison were. These high-quality stopover locations have to have abundant insect populations to refuel these little guys. But they're becoming smaller in size and much harder to find due to our rampant destruction of grassland ecosystems, the heavy use of pesticides and herbicides and insecticides is devastating these stopover points. And because they're becoming smaller and harder to find, there's a much reduced prey abundance. Food is just becoming much more difficult to find. Larks in particular on the Great Plains have declined by 60 to 67% in recent years. This is a alfalfa field that's been, a potato field that's been treated with Roundup. And Roundup it kills everything that it touches if it's an insect on that landscape. So bison reintroductions to wild places can be crucial for the survival of insectivores. As was mentioned at the start, I've, since my first introduction to bison in 1984, had the opportunity to participate in translocating bison into new herds. And if there's a free-ranging plains or wood bison in Canada, Alaska, or Siberia, I had the privilege of helping put them there. And by doing that, we can establish some of the ancient linkages between these species. We can reestablish healthy, vibrant, stopover ecosystems scattered along the length of the migratory path of birds. In 2016, there were almost 70 plains bison herds managed for conservation, state, national, provincial parks are there for bison conservation primarily. And in addition to those, there's over 2,000 private ranches and farms in North America now. The total plains bison population has rebounded to somewhere between 450 and 500,000 animals. So that's a pretty significant recovery in just a matter of less than a century, really. Banff National Park was the last place in Canada where bison were reintroduced into a free-ranging landscape like this. And they're doing all the things that bison did back there historically for thousands of years. wintering in the valley bottoms and summering up on these high alpine slopes, and doing all the migration movements that bison once did back there, and doing their part to contribute to the recovery of the birds that are living on that landscape. So most native species co-evolved with bison. Used a pair of brown-headed cowbirds catching a ride. Brown-headed cowbirds, coincidentally, were not a bird that was common across the Great Plains. They were a bird initially that was restricted to the Gulf states, Texas primarily. And it was the movement of Texas longhorns north to the railheads in northern U.S. and southern Canada that enticed the birds to follow them north. And now they're ubiquitous. They're virtually everywhere. Most of these birds were dependent on bison to some degree, whether it's their fur for nesting or for insects for food. And it was the extirpation of bison that caused massive changes, especially for grassland birds and the insects that they feeded on. Some species of native dung beetles may have become extinct. That's a question that I've had for dung beetle specialists for some time, is how do we know if they're extinct? And we had no evidence of their being there before. You can't count what's now missing. And the use of modern livestock dewormers over the past 40 years has made the situation significantly worse. The good news, though, is that grassland habitat loss has slowed in recent years. Cattle and bison ranchers now have an alternative safe use to drugs, and they're using them where they can. This is one example of a product called Safeguard. It's a diatomaceous earth, ground up seashells that are extremely fine, and bison love it. They'll wallow in that patch of diatomaceous earth. She's covered with it, and that kills all the external parasites that are feeding on her and makes her less tempting to biting flies and harassing insects as well. So if you're a livestock producer concerned about the impacts of your deworming program, talk to your veterinarian, switch to a dewormer that doesn't have such long-lasting environmental impacts. Ask your veterinarian for suggestions that suit your personal breeding programs. And change for centuries, so it's not centuries, hundreds of, at least 100 years now, cattle producers will bring their animals off the winter range, off the summer range, feed them at home, but then not release them back out onto the pastures until sometimes mid-May, sometimes later than that, later than when the birds are arriving and hoping to find a meal of dung fauna insects. So if you can treat the livestock during the late winter and they arrive on the landscape with clean dung, that'll certainly make a big difference. And then, of course, the best option is simply raise bison. Most bison producers don't treat their animals with anti-parasitic drugs, so they create a healthy ecosystem. And perhaps the most important conclusion of them all is every new bison population adds to the recovery of species at risk and improves ecosystem diversity. And we documented all of that in this book. It was mentioned at the start, The Ecological Buffalo. A little plug for myself. If you happen to need a guest speaker at a conference or something, give me a shout. You can find my contact information there. And I'll happily entertain any questions. Oh, and I just have to let you know that we're working on our new book, The Evolution of Bison. This follows the species for the last 3.3 million years through to today, and all of the benefits and challenges that they faced through that time frame. So hopefully there's a few questions that Teresa can share with us.
Thank you so much, Wes. Every time I learn so much from you, so there's always more to learn about bison. If anybody has questions, please put them into the Q&A. I do have one so far about Jim McPhail having read a number of studies linking large mammal extinctions to people who came to the Americas. So I guess the question is referring to the quaternary extinction that you mentioned. Was it climate-based or?
The quaternary extinction event was primarily climate-based. The Pleistocene was a cold environment for most of its 2.8 million years. But towards the end of it, the climate began to warm. And with climate warming, it caused a change in the vegetation. You think back to that mammoth steppe landscape. 63% of the vegetation on the mammoth steppe was grasses and forbs. There were no trees. It was like being in the central Great Plains. Because it was a cold environment, trees couldn't grow there. There wasn't enough moisture to support trees. But as the climate warmed at the tail end of the Pleistocene and beginning of the Holocene, that changed. And moisture began to come more frequently and in greater volumes. Climates warmed, and there was a gradual switch from open steppe grasslands, like Mongolia, for example, to what we see now across the north of boreal forests and aspen parkland. Those types of communities that could no longer support the megafauna that lived there. They couldn't adapt fast enough to that change in their food resources. And for some reason, bison did. They squeaked through. As I mentioned, they're the only species of megafauna that survived that extinction event. Bison have been in North America for 135,000 years, and people much less than that. Certainly people contributed to the extinction of species like mammoth and mastodons, but not so much to the extinction of these early bison species. That was habitat change.
Okay. Thank you. So next question from Anne. If a farmer was interested in raising bison, where would they go about obtaining one, and which species or combination?
Excellent question. Join an organization here in Alberta. The organization is the Bison Producers of Alberta. The national organization is the Canadian Bison Association. They each have websites. Every province has its organization and websites associated with them. And on those websites, there's a listing of all of the producers that belong to those organizations. So it's a great place to start. And as to which species or subspecies of bison to raise, Plains bison entered the Canadian livestock industry back in a fairly large way in the 1960s. And they didn't grow very much. It was a fairly small livestock industry. And for some reason, that began to change in the 1980s, early 1990s, and there was a pretty significant jump in the number of plains bison herds across the country. Wood bison weren't released from Elk Island National Park to the commercial industry until the late 90s. And because they were so few, they were coveted. People were diligent about maintaining purebred wood bison herds. But then in the early 2000s, the trend started where somebody figured out that if you crossbred a plains bison cow with a wood bison bull, you got more of the preferred meat cuts off of that carcass. And there was a gradual trend then to crossbreeding plains bison and wood bison, to the point now where it's almost impossible to find a purebred plains bison in the industry in Canada. There's still both subspecies have been registered with the Canadian Livestock Pedigree Act as purebred plains bison herds and purebred wood bison herds, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to the roughly 125,000 plains bison in Canada, or bison in Canada, the majority of which are hybrids, crosses between the two. So it's personal preference which one you want to get into. It's strictly a financial and ethical decision on the producer's part.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. Next question, also about raising bison. How many can comfortably forage on a quarter, and what types of forage are best suited to supporting them?
Yeah, good question, and one that's impossible to answer. Because every quarter section is different in what's growing on there. I have 80 acres of aspen forest, and I couldn't support a plains bison here we just don't have the habitat. But if you've got a quarter section of really nice, pristine native prairie, you could probably have 30 to 40 bison on that landscape. The best way to figure this out is simply to go out there after the growing season is finished, flip a meter of grass, weigh it, and figure out what biomass you got. And then from there, it's an easy step to figure out how many animals you can support. If the person who's asking that question is serious about the answer, they can give me an email, and I'll certainly give them more detail on how to get started.
Sure. A question from the chat. How many species of bison existed at the same time before only the wood and plains bison were left?
There's 7.
Evolution 1.
Yeah, 7 different species or subspecies of bison from their first appearance in North America through to the modern plains and woods today.
Over time.
Over that 135,000 years. Most of them were not concurrent. One species would slowly adapt to changing environments and become a different species. That takes thousands of years. and occasionally there was subspecies on the land at the same time.
Here's another difficult one to answer. Would we ever be able to recover to a large percentage of what we had before the decline?
There's too many people on the planet now. Too many people who are wanting to plow up native prairie and put it into monocultures. The landscape just isn't there. But it raises an interesting question too: is where is hope for rematriating bison? And in my opinion, the best hope for the future of bison in North America is on First Nations lands in Canada and the U.S. They have control over significantly large landscapes that, in a lot of cases, have not been negatively impacted by monoculture agriculture. And there's a big movement across North America right now to bring bison back onto First Nations lands. Mm-hmm. Just last week, for the first time in history, 11 bison from Yellowstone National Park arrived across the border and are now on Mosquito First Nation in Saskatchewan. So that's really hopeful.
Yeah, I'm realizing there may have been a bit of confusion with the question about like extinction or extirpation of the buffalo, and certainly when it happened in the 1880s, that was human caused.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, just to clarify that, when we were talking about the extinction event that only buffalo survived versus the 1880s, that was definitely caused by humans.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Just to clarify that, I saw a comment in the chat.
But the early people, when they arrived here, certainly did harvest bison, and they did it in very significant ways. You know, when you think of the first people to arrive in North America, and there's always discussion about when this took place and how they got here, but they certainly came through Beringia into what's now Alaska and the Yukon. And they were trapped there for a long time by the continental glaciers that constricted the movement of anything south into the southern part of North America. So they developed techniques for hunting barren ground caribou, and techniques that are still you can see them on the landscape today in Northwest Territories and Northern Yukon. I remember flying in the Northern Yukon back in the 70s and seeing this long linear rows of trees that had been munched up and laid down as a drive lane that terminated in a circular trap. That was a drive lane to capture caribou. And in those days, they captured large numbers of caribou in that V-shaped funnel, chase them into that round pen, and sticking out of the walls of the pen, which are fabricated out of logs and covered with hides, were these poles with a noose or a snare on the end of it. And the caribou would run around the interior of that trap and get hung up on these neck snares where they could be efficiently killed. They brought that technology south as the ice-free corridor opened and allowed the movement of people and bison into the southern part of Canada and U.S. and converted it to bison traps, pounds. There's a really significant one on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border called, it skipped my brain.
One of those days.
Did the same thing. Pound maker's pound, a Cree trap. And it was littered with bones of decades of trapping bison in there like this. And so technology moved with the people as they explored and moved into the southern parts of the province. And they certainly did hunt bison in large numbers, but not to the point of extirpation.
Okay, I have a couple of questions around policy. So one is, are there policies in place in areas where bison are being reintroduced to prevent hunting if they were to wander outside the park? And are they considered a protected species? And then the other question was, what are your suggestions to federal and provincial policymakers?
Excellent points. It varies across the country. BC and Saskatchewan, Manitoba all list bison as a wildlife species. Alberta doesn't. In Alberta, if it's a free-ranging bison outside of Wood Buffalo National Park or the very northwest corner where we established the salmon lake population, if it's a bison anywhere else in the province and it's running free, it's a feral bison. It has no status as a wildlife animal. That's changing, fortunately, with the reintroduction of bison into Banff. There's negotiations going on right now between the federal government and Alberta to allow those bison that leave the east side of Banff National Park onto places like the Awatinda Horse Ranch to be considered wildlife species. And I think in the relatively short time, that's going to come true. There's also another awesome adventure taking place on the Canada-U.S. border with the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. They want to establish in Parks Canada, it's a cooperative agreement between the Blackfeet, Glacier National Park, and Waterton Lakes National Park to establish a free-ranging transboundary plains bison population that will move up and down the east slopes of the Rockies from Waterton south to the southern end of Glacier National Park and in and out of the Blackfeet Reservation. That's a pretty significant move. It's already begun. They're fencing Highway 5 to prevent the animals moving east. But in the very near future, there's going to be a transboundary free-ranging wild plains bison herd there. I'm not sure if I captured all the points on that one.
I mean, I think so. And what do you think, like, what kind of policy do you think needs to be enacted in future?
Yeah. Well, of course, every bison that lives within a national park is automatically protected and considered wildlife. Alberta's the laggard. We need to see Alberta step up and say, if there's a free-ranging bison population established, I should back up. Every free-ranging wood bison population currently has a status of wildlife in the province, except for those immediately around Wood Buffalo National Park, because the animals in the park carry, roughly 60% of them carry TB or brucellosis. And there's been a decades-long move to trap those diseases in the park by slaughtering every bison that comes out of the park. Every bison that leaves the park has no status, and anybody can hunt it at any time of the year as a way of controlling the potential spread of those two diseases. But it would be nice if Alberta stepped up and said, like BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan have done, that plains bison are indeed wildlife. It's ironic to me that the most significant animal on the North American continent doesn't have that status.
Yeah. I guess relating to that, how well can cattle, if at all, replace the role of bison?
They can very well be a surrogate for bison. Not 100%, partially because they don't shed their hair the same way that bison do, so there's no benefit to bison or to cattle hair for nesting birds. Bison, one of the really dominant features of them on the landscape are the wallows that they leave behind, the dust bowls that they create. Cattle don't do that. And bison wallows are tremendous at creating ecosystem diversity on the ecosystems where bison live. And they support a whole host of species that you can't find on cattle pastures. And a good example is the Great Plains toad and the spade-footed toad. Both of them historically would use flooded bison wallows in the spring to lay their eggs. Those are all gone now. So the habitat opportunities for those two species of toads are consequently restricted. So the cattle can be, and if their dung on the landscape is free of abrumectins, they can certainly play a significant role in boosting the insect population for insectivores.
Yeah, and I guess you kind of alluded to us not really knowing which dung beetles survive in cattle versus.
There's still a broad diversity of native dung beetles in North America, but by far the majority of them now are introduced species. In continents like Australia, where they didn't have dung pat-forming animals, now that there's cattle there, they've reintroduced a multitude of dung beetle species to provide that benefit back to the landscape again. The introduction of dung beetles is a really important effort by conservation agencies worldwide now.
Interesting. I had not considered that. I just want to be, so we have 5 minutes left. I just want to be aware of time here. We have several questions still.
Is it?
Are you okay to continue?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yep.
Okay, I have one about from the chat. How are you working with, or what has been your involvement with local First Nations communities in reclaiming the relationship with the bison?
Yeah. I retired from Parks Canada in 2012 after 32 years working there and set up my own bison consulting business with the primary focus of helping either ranchers or farmers or First Nations people bring bison back onto their lands. And the dominant focus of that effort has been First Nations. I wrote the Bison Management Plan for the Kainai First Nation and on the Blood Indian Reserve in southern Alberta. They now have a thriving population of bison there. I just finished writing an extensive one for Mistwasis First Nation in central Saskatchewan, and they're diligently working towards bringing bison back there. And I routinely receive phone calls and emails from nations across the country asking what can they do, what steps can they take to bring bison back to their lands. That's a real joy for me, is helping these people reconnect with not just the animal, but to allow them to reconnect to their ceremonies and cultural lifestyles that have vanished over the last 100 years. To see that returning is hugely rewarding to me. I'm working with a couple Métis organizations in northern Alberta as well. They want to bring bison back onto Métis lands. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see more bison on First Nations and Métis lands in the future.
I think someone had commented in the chat that the Métis Nations of Saskatchewan just got rematriated bison to the Patoche area as well. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, here's a question. So thank you for a wonderfully informative presentation. We run a herd of yaks providing ecological services. Are you aware of decision-based protocol for the treatment of parasites?
Not specifically, no. For yak in particular?
Not sure. Okay.
If they have one, I'd love to see it.
That might be a good discussion to have with your veterinarian and to talk about fecal egg counts and related fecal egg count and treatment.
Okay.
I know a lot of veterinarians are not familiar with the negative side effects of having treated their animals with ivermectins. I gave a presentation at the vet college in Saskatoon to the professors who teach veterinary medicine, and they were all mystified. They'd never heard of it. The impact that the drugs they were prescribing were having on the downstream species. So query your veterinarian for sure about their knowledge about how they can treat the animals and not have negative environmental consequences.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Do you know if there are any impacts to the bison health that were placed in the tar sands reclamation sites?
No, to date, none. And that's a bit of a surprise. You think of these animals living within Mordor. I mean, it's a very unusual place to see bison on that landscape. But they've done extensive testing the entire time that they're there. And they do routine hair sampling and blood sampling. They certainly are aware of all of the every calf that's born reproductive rates. And to date, they've never found a negative impact of having them on those reclaimed lands, which is really rewarding. I went there expecting to see all kinds of ugly stuff and couldn't find it.
That's great to hear.
I wrote the Bison Management Plan for them as well and helped them develop a couple different pastures.
I think we might have, I don't know if it was just me, but we might have just lost your sound for a second there.
Oh, how am I now?
Good. Okay, so maybe one last question. So there have been contentions around the wood bison herd in the Yukon with free range. The herd growing exponentially, resulting in some human-wildlife conflicts. Do you have any knowledge of this and resultant policies to protect both animals and people?
I helped put the bison there back in the early 80s. A small herd that we reintroduced into the Middling River Valley. Had to think for a second. And they did very well, but the herd split. And one group came south from the release areas onto the Alaska Highway not very far east of Haines Junction, between Haines Junction and Whitehorse. And there were vehicle collisions. Certainly bison were killed. People were severely injured. I don't know if anybody died, but it was a problem. Because the grass along the roadsides was better than what they were finding in the bush. So that population, that small herd that was captured and taken to a private bison producer in the Yukon and held there for a short while. Then they were taken from there, that whole subgroup of bison, and released or taken to a place called the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center south of Anchorage, where they sat in captivity from the late 80s all the way through until 2015 was the first time that those animals were released out into the wilderness of Alaska. Those animals that are now free-ranging, there's been 2 reintroductions of bison into central Alaska from the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center and from Elk Island. The Alaska government has an agreement with Elk Island that every 2 years they'll get 40 bison from Elk Island to supplement these now free-ranging herds. And those animals have all the protection that the state can provide them. There's no hunting on them and won't be for some time to come. But the purpose of reestablishing that population is to reestablish the hunting by First Nations eventually down the road. I lost my train of thought. Repeat the question.
It was about human-wildlife conflicts.
That population has gone from, I think we reintroduced 50 animals to the Yukon, and now there's 1,500. And they're dispersed all the way west towards Kluane National Park. But the majority of them still hang out in that Nisling River, Northern Skull River Valley, all that stretch of land north of the Alaska Highway. And they are doing very well. The Yukon government, their school system had a program for quite a few years. I think it may have ended, but I'm not sure, where they took grade 7 and grade 9 classes and kids out on the landscape for 10 days to hunt a bison with a First Nations guide. I went on one of those trips with them and taught the kids about buffalo anatomy and behavior and ecology and whatnot while we were out there. And then a bison was harvested and the kids were there through that whole process. So there was a big learning opportunity for a large number of youth in the Yukon to learn about the importance of having bison on that landscape and to understand better some of the human-wildlife conflicts that take place. There was a hunter killed by a bison there after he shot it, thought it was dead and it wasn't, and it got him. So that's a pretty direct human-wildlife conflict issue, but it's very, very rare.
Yes.
There was a study done by the Yukon biologist responsible for bison, Tom Young, where he was, because he's been pestered by that same question by the public, what impact are these free-ranging bison having on resident moose, elk, caribou, and bighorn sheep? So he conducted an extensive study looking at potential competition between those species and found none. In fact, what was happening was the bison were creating better habitat for all those other herbivores, including horses. The horses that are feral in the Yukon now are actually, there's a movement to have them identified as a wild species in the Yukon because they're identical to the horse that was there during the Pleistocene.
Well,
so yeah, lots of work being done on human-wildlife conflict and habitat in the Yukon in particular.
Very cool. Well, I think maybe we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much, Wes.
My pleasure.
There have been a couple of people asking in the chat if the session is being recorded. Yes, it is, and it'll be posted on YouTube. And you can also watch our webinar from last year that we had with Wes if you missed it. And there were some people also asking about the Buffalo Treaty. So I encourage you to check out the Buffalo Treaty website to learn more. And I'll also just plug that there's actually a free film screening of the film Singing Back the Buffalo by Tasha Hubbard happening tonight in person at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, but they're also doing it online for free. So if you would like to watch it today at 7 p.m. Winnipeg time, I'll just throw it into the chat and maybe that can help answer the questions that were more about the Buffalo Treaty.
I highly recommend that film. It's beautifully done. It's a wonderful film.
And then, of course, many, many thanks being expressed in the chat.
My pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. Always happy to chat with folks about bison.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks so much, Wes.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.